Most bad decisions don't feel wrong when you make them. They feel familiar, and that's the real problem. Because when your brain starts confusing familiarity with correctness, something subtle happens over time. Your decisions begin repeating the same emotional patterns, and your life starts repeating the same outcomes. Careers stall. Opportunities look wrong when they're actually right. 5 years pass, and your trajectory hasn't really changed. This isn't about intelligence or discipline. It's about a decision loop your brain builds automatically. Past emotional experiences train your brain to recognize patterns, but instead of optimizing for better outcomes, it often optimizes for emotional predictability. Which means you may not actually be choosing what's best. You may just be choosing what your brain already knows how to feel. And the longer that loop runs, the harder it becomes to see alternatives, which quietly reduces your leverage, your optionality, and the range of decisions you're capable of making. In this video, we'll break down 3 signs your brain is running an emotional decision loop, and 1 adjustment that can break the pattern. The day usually starts the same way. You open your laptop, a few unread emails, a couple of Slack messages, maybe a small task that carried over from yesterday. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. So you begin clearing things one by one, a quick reply here, a small fix there. A short message to confirm a meeting time. Another message answering a question someone asked yesterday afternoon. It feels productive. You're moving. You're solving things. You're keeping everything organized. By mid-morning, a few more things appear. Someone asks for clarification on a project. A minor issue pops up that needs a quick solution. Another message arrives that only takes 2 minutes to answer. So you handle those too. Small problems are satisfying like that. They have clear edges. You can solve them quickly, you can move on, and each time you finish one, there's a small sense of completion. By the afternoon, most of the day has filled itself with these kinds of decisions. Reply or wait, approve or adjust, send a quick response or leave a short comment. None of them feel particularly important, but each one moves the day forward. Meanwhile, there are usually a few larger things sitting quietly in the background, a bigger project that would require deeper thinking, a conversation that might change the direction of something, an opportunity someone mentioned last week that you haven't really looked at yet. Nothing urgent about those either. They can wait. And compared to the smaller tasks, they're less defined. They require more energy, more uncertainty, so it feels reasonable to focus on the things that are clearer first. You tell yourself you'll return to the bigger things once the smaller ones are finished. But small tasks have a way of multiplying. One message leads to another. One quick decision creates 2 more follow-ups. By the end of the day, you've solved dozens of small problems. You stayed busy. You stayed responsible. You stayed on top of things. And from the outside, it looks exactly like progress. But if someone looked closely at the decisions made throughout the day, they would notice something subtle. Almost every choice followed the same direction, toward the option that felt easiest to process, the option that required the least uncertainty, the option that felt familiar, not obviously wrong, just slightly more comfortable than the alternatives. And at this point, it doesn't look like a pattern yet. It just looks like a normal workday. The next day doesn't look very different. You open your laptop again. Messages waiting, a few tasks already sitting in the queue. You begin the same way most people do, clearing what's in front of you. Quick responses first, small decisions, minor adjustments. It keeps things moving. And once you're already in motion, it becomes easier to keep choosing the next thing that fits the same rhythm. A message that can be answered quickly, a task that can be finished in 10 minutes, a request that only requires a small correction, nothing complicated. Meanwhile, the larger decisions remain slightly out of reach. Maybe someone sent you an introduction to a new opportunity. Not urgent, not required, just something worth considering. You open the message, read part of it, and then close the tab. You'll come back to it later. Another message arrives. That one is easier to answer. Later in the week, something similar happens again. A colleague mentions a project outside your usual scope. It could be interesting, but it would also require learning new constraints, new people, new expectations. So the response is cautious. Maybe later. Let's revisit this in a few months. Nothing is rejected outright, but nothing really shifts either. And none of these decisions feel like mistakes. In fact, they usually feel responsible. You're protecting your time, staying focused, avoiding unnecessary complexity. But over time, something small begins to repeat. Certain opportunities feel immediately comfortable. They resemble things you've done before. They come from people you already know. They follow processes you already understand. And when those appear, the decision is fast. Yes. Other opportunities feel slightly different, not dangerous, just unfamiliar. They involve new environments, different expectations, outcomes that are harder to predict, and those decisions take longer. You reread the message. You wait a day before replying. Sometimes you don't reply at all. Nothing dramatic happens. The workday still fills itself. Projects move forward. Tasks get completed. From the outside, everything continues to look stable, but if someone tracked the types of choices being made across weeks and months, they might notice a small shift. The range of decisions slowly begins to narrow. Not intentionally, just quietly. And because each individual choice feels reasonable, the pattern is almost impossible to notice while it's happening. After a while, something small begins to feel familiar about the results too. Not in a negative way, just recognizable. The work continues, projects get completed, new tasks replace the old ones. But many of the situations start looking similar. The same types of problems, the same kinds of meetings, the same scope of responsibility. If you compare this month to 6 months ago, nothing seems particularly wrong. You're still busy. People still rely on you. Your calendar still fills itself without much effort. In fact, the routine has become easier to manage. You already know how most situations will unfold. When a message arrives, you usually know what it will require before even opening it. When a meeting appears on your calendar, you already understand the kind of conversation that will happen inside it. The environment becomes predictable, and predictability has advantages. You move faster. You make decisions quickly. You rarely feel lost in unfamiliar territory, but something else quietly appears alongside that efficiency. Very little surprises you anymore. Projects begin to resemble previous projects. New responsibilities look almost identical to the ones you handled last year. Even when something changes slightly, it usually stays within the same boundaries. So your decisions become faster. Because the situations already feel known. You've seen this type of problem before. You've handled this kind of request before. You already know which option tends to work. And most of the time, those decisions work well enough. Nothing collapses. Nothing creates obvious failure. But after a while, a subtle realization appears. Effort continues. Days remain full. But the outcomes start repeating, the same level of progress, the same types of results, the same kinds of opportunities showing up again. You might notice it when looking back at an older calendar, or when someone asks what has changed over the last few years. The answer isn't nothing. Things have moved. Tasks have been completed, projects have been delivered, but the trajectory itself looks surprisingly similar. Not worse, just almost identical. And because every individual decision felt reasonable at the time, it's difficult to point to a specific moment where anything went wrong. At some point, the speed of your decisions becomes noticeable, not because things are moving too fast, but because many choices no longer require much thinking. A situation appears. You recognize it almost immediately. You've seen something like this before. The tone of the message, the type of request, the way a project is framed. Within a few seconds, you already have a sense of which direction feels right. Sometimes you can't even explain why. It just feels like the correct move, so the response becomes quick. Yes, that works. Let's do it that way. Sounds good. And most of the time, those decisions work. Nothing breaks. Projects move forward. People stay satisfied. But occasionally, something slightly different appears. A new type of project, an unfamiliar role in a conversation, an opportunity that doesn't quite resemble the situations you're used to handling. When those appear, the reaction is different. The decision slows down. You reread the message. You think about the risks. You wonder how much extra time it might require. There's a small sense of friction, not fear, just uncertainty. So the response becomes cautious. Maybe later, maybe after the current workload settles, maybe once a few other things are finished. Again, none of this feels like avoidance. It feels practical. You're simply choosing the options that are clearer, the ones that come with fewer unknowns. And over time, those choices start forming a quiet rhythm. Familiar situations create fast decisions. Unfamiliar ones create hesitation. That pattern begins repeating across weeks, then months. Eventually, it becomes difficult to tell whether a decision feels correct because it's objectively better, or simply because it resembles something your mind has already processed before. But even at this point, the pattern is still incomplete. The routine still works, work still moves forward, results still appear, so there's no obvious reason to question the process yet. At first, the rhythm feels efficient. You recognize situations quickly, you respond quickly. Most days move forward without much friction, and that efficiency becomes part of your reputation. People know you're reliable. You handle familiar problems well. You move projects forward without hesitation. You rarely create unnecessary complications. From the outside, it looks like strong decision-making, but over time, a quieter change begins happening around the edges. Certain opportunities stop appearing, not suddenly, just gradually. A colleague who once mentioned an experimental project now brings it up with someone else. A conversation about a different role happens in another room. A new initiative forms, but your name doesn't naturally come up during the early discussions. Nothing dramatic, you're still included in the work you're known for. But the work you're known for rarely changes. The same types of responsibilities return, the same range of problems, the same scope of influence. And because you've become very efficient inside that range, the system around you begins reinforcing it. People send you what you handle well. They trust you with what you've already proven you can do, which means the incoming decisions begin resembling the previous ones even more. And that makes each choice easier, faster, more predictable. But predictability carries a quiet trade-off. When most decisions happen inside the same boundaries, the number of possible directions slowly shrinks, not intentionally, just structurally. If someone asked what new environments you've operated in over the last few years, the answer might be smaller than expected. If someone asked what kinds of decisions you're making today compared to 5 years ago, many of them would look surprisingly familiar. The effort hasn't decreased. In many cases, it has increased, but the range of possible outcomes begins narrowing. A promotion discussion takes longer than expected. A role that seemed possible last year quietly goes to someone else. A project that could have expanded your scope never quite enters the conversation. None of these moments feel like clear rejection. They simply pass.